Welcome to the latest episode of First Word in Sport, Friday morning, joined by John Knight this morning. No, James. I would say had too many beers with him last night and he isn't able to make it, but that isn't the case. He has other work commitments. How are you, John? It's been a fun-filled week of contentious decisions.
Yeah, how's it going, Luke? Plenty to talk about, and it's Friday, so those of us with day jobs are always, in a decent mood on a Friday, and I'm looking forward to it.
So let's roll back to, let's do this in a chronological order. So let's look back on Monday. We had the Manchester United and Brentford game. It was quite an interesting game in as much as obviously United ran out 2-1 winners, but it was not a great performance from Manchester United, all said and done. Not for the first time recently. It feels like they dodged some bullets. They dodged some bullets against Chelsea the game before that. And they keep walking away with all 3 points.
Yeah, it does feel like Carrick's had a decent amount of breaks in his short time as manager, doesn't it? Um, it was it was an okay performance from United. I mean, they did lead from the 11th minute, I think. So you have to sort of view the game through that lens. They're defending a lead. Brentford are expected to come at them. But still, at the end of the day, you're talking about Man United at home against Brentford. And I think the touches in the box were 42 to 21 in favour of Brentford. So twice as many touches in the box. Essentially, most of the game is being played in Man United's third. And they're playing on the break at home, which it's not really what's supposed to be happening is at Man United. So, yes, they're getting results, but it's not a style of football that implies that they're close to, launching a title challenge next year with a couple of good buys. It doesn't feel like that to me. It still feels like they're very much in that big pack of teams from them all the way, probably all the way down to Spurs. It just feels like one big pack. That the league is just so congested at the moment. So, yeah, I know some people will be feeling like United are on the verge of great things, but I don't know. Next year they're going to have Europe again. Big difference playing without Europe, and we'll see. We'll see who they appoint in the summer, of course. Will it be Carrick or will it be someone else? They'll probably make a big difference.
I certainly hope so. As a fan of as a non-Manchester United fan, I just don't see it, longer term. He doesn't have nearly enough experience, for arguably what is one of the top 5 jobs in the world. I mean, it's easy to forget this. That is a massive job. It needs a massive personality. It needs someone who's proven, and Carrick isn't that man. Once again, one thing that is interesting is how many goals have come from set pieces this year. Casemiro scored again, and he's obviously off in the summer. I tell you, they'll do well to replace his, goal output. He may have a lot of other flaws. He obviously played very well on Monday night, but they'll do well to replace his output from set pieces.
Yeah, if you look at their season, I think you could sort of characterize it by the fact that you've got Bruno with 19 assists and you've got Casemiro with 9 goals, both of which are unusual outliers and sort of like a career season for both of them, isn't it? But you've also got Casemiro who's 34 and leaving in the summer, like you said. And then you've got Bruno who's turning 32 this year. And it's a funny one. I think Bruno's obviously a fantastic player, but he was such a big problem for Amorim because he didn't really fit into Amorim's formation. And so he was playing him deeper, wasn't he, in the sort of a midfield two, and that left them pretty exposed. And the simplest change that Carrick's made is playing with a sort of a proper two and Bruno a bit further forward. But I think increasingly, as he gets into his 30s, it's the legs aren't there, so you do need that other player to do the running for him. And this is the problem with a lot of players as they get older. They still can have the goal output, the assist output, but it's the sort of dirty side of the game they're not able to do as much. And so you need that from elsewhere in the team.
I think one thing is interesting is I see Mainu has signed a new contract at Manchester United, and I hate this sort of situation where a player has a good, say, 2 months, maybe 3 months, hasn't blown anyone away. It's not like you watched that game on Monday night and said, whilst he was good, he wasn't amazing. And suddenly he gets rewarded with, a big fat new contract. I don't know. It just seems very short-term thinking.
Yeah, I guess so. It's difficult with football, isn't it? I mean, you do have to extend players, or you end up losing them for nothing. So, yeah, I don't know. He's an interesting one. Of course, he was just frozen out, wasn't he, under Amorim, and then immediately comes back into the team under Carrick. It sort of reminded me of Adebayor at Spurs, where he was frozen out, and then Tim Sherwood comes in and he goes straight into the team. It's funny how these caretaker managers or interim managers quite often do that. They'll just immediately put someone back in that wasn't getting on with the previous manager. I don't know if it reflects badly on Amorim, if it reflects badly on Mainu. We don't know, of course, because we don't know what was happening behind the scenes. But it will be interesting to see how his career goes. I mean, he was starting for England in international tournaments at a very young age, and there were other options, So Southgate clearly liked him. So I mean, we'll see. Who knows? He might go on to be a superstar, or might be going to be sort of pretty average. We don't really know.
Well, what it did was it cemented United's position in top three. They're looking at unbelievable shape now for Champions League football. So, which in itself you have to sort of take your cap off to Carrick that he's managed to do that so efficiently almost. Let's just touch on the Championship from Tuesday before we look at the Champions League and all that entailed. On Tuesday we had Southampton-Ipswich, ended up 2-2 with a late equaliser for Ipswich. What it does is it means Ipswich are now on 81 points, Millwall 80, Middlesbrough 79. One game left of the regular season. All the games are 12:30 on Saturday. So Ipswich are at home to QPR, Millwall are home to Oxford United, and Middlesbrough away at Wrexham. So essentially, if Ipswich beat QPR at home, they will be the second team who get promoted.
Yeah, which is fair enough. I mean, they would be the best of those teams to come up. So, it's if the likes of Millwall come up, I think it'll be a bit of a farce. They'll just take thrashings all over the place, won't they? But yeah, what is it? 3-1 on. So, well, that tells you the chances, doesn't it? So if they should get it done, about 75% maybe to come up. And yeah, fair play. I know the manager there has done a reasonable job. He was linked with some big jobs for a while, wasn't he? And that sort of quieted down after the relegation. But he's, I guess, rebuilding his reputation pretty well. So yeah, I guess we'll see if they can do any better than last time they came up.
So let's talk about the big action which we've had this week. It started on Tuesday evening with Paris Saint-Germain Bayern Munich. Ended up 5-4. Not sure you see many better games than that one. It was wild. It was exciting. It was, full of quality. It was worthy of being a final. I mean, it always felt that way, that this was a tie that, if this had been the final, no one would have complained. But yeah, we were just treated to an unbelievable match.
Yeah, it was brilliant, wasn't it? It was, it was just, it was one of those games where there'd be a goalmouth incident, and they're showing the replay of it, and then they almost miss the next goalmouth incident while they're showing the replay, because it really was just crazy end-to-end stuff. And yeah, I love to see it, and I find myself always rooting for it when you get these teams that play these wild attacking styles of football. Like, it never seems to quite work in the end, but I'm always rooting for it to work, because I mean, it's just so much fun to see teams playing like that. And yeah, it's one of the best games certainly that I feel like I can remember seeing. Just just so much fun. I mean, football can be quite dull, on occasions, and so when you see a great game like that, I think it's because
we're not talking about Arsenal yet.
No, sorry, yeah, we'll get onto them. But yeah, but that is what makes games like this so good, right? If every game was like this, then it wouldn't stand out. So yeah, it was a lot of fun. I guess we can talk about some of the penalty incidents in this one as well.
So let's talk about the handball. Just never been a massive fan of this type of, handball. Yes, I just think it's incredibly harsh, particularly when you get the little deflection off the thigh. Yes, he shouldn't have his hands out. They know the rules. It just seems such a disproportionate punishment for what the crime is. We can talk a little bit later about the value of penalties, but this was just a great example of, an innocuous cross resulting in a goal. It's never sat quite right with me.
Yeah, completely agree. And it's a little bit like the fouling goalkeepers at corners thing, where when it first starts happening, I'm just every week I'm going, well, that's a foul, and then in the end, it happens so often that you just sort of go, well, yeah, they're just letting that go now. And with these handballs, I just think it's absolutely ridiculous. But I mean, we've sort of learned now over the years, haven't we? Especially in Europe, that they just basically give anything like this. I did think when I saw the replay and I saw that it'd come off his thigh onto his hand, I thought, okay, well, surely they'll surely they'll let him get away with that. If it's like it hasn't even gone straight onto his hand, it's come off his leg onto his hand. I mean, just absolutely nonsense. He hasn't got his hand stuck out by miles. It's just slightly away from his body. And I think, unfortunately, you just have to watch football now knowing that it's almost like there's just these random penalties that get awarded because the ball just happens to hit someone's hand and no one can really do anything about it. From an attacking point of view, I guess just get the ball in the box, rifle it at defenders, get it bouncing around, and you might get lucky and have it happen for you.
I do think that's a good point in that, teams are rewarded, for getting in the box per se, creating chaos. You're not getting rewarded if you're playing in your own half. There's also an incentive to get the ball wide as well, because that's where most of these. I know Arsenal, obviously, in the Arsenal game, there's one which was more central, but most of them come from crosses.
Yeah, I mean that's right. There's still a huge luck factor, but at least you do have to actually get forward and get the ball in the box. What did you think about the first penalty? So I'm not a big fan of these either, to be honest with you, because yes, the defender comes sliding in. Diaz then just deliberately induces the contact, doesn't he? He just sticks his leg in the way of the defender who's going for the ball. And it sort of reminds me of those ones in basketball, in basketball where they do the pump fake and then just lean into the defender to induce the contact. And I just think referees need to be a little bit wiser to stuff like that, to be honest with you, because I just don't think that should be a penalty. If the attacker is deliberately inducing the contact and not just making a natural football move, then I just don't think it should be a foul. What do you think?
No, I agree in that as much as, and we'll talk about natural movements with regard to Eze when we talk about the Arsenal game. But I do feel like, as you say, if it's not a natural movement in terms of what you would do in a normal course of the match, then you are sort of playing the system a little bit, playing the rules, and it just doesn't sit that well. I mean, it's I'm not going to call it cheating, but it's and I think the phrase that always gets me when you hear the commentator say, "Oh, he's been clever." I mean, it's basically just saying he's cheating, or it's a bit soft. It's that's not what penalties should be about. It shouldn't be about decisions that are soft. It shouldn't be about strikers being clever. It should, it's whether is it a foul, like yes or no. It's not. There's so much going on around all these incidents now, and as we well know, is that players are so rewarded for sort of gaming the system that we end up in these situations.
Yeah, it is, and it is such a crucial part of the game as a forward that I'd imagine that's probably in training sessions now when these kids are at academies when they're 10 or 11 years old. I mean, this is something you probably have to work on quite a lot, is when a defender comes in, if you're able to put your leg in the way of his sliding tackle, being really good at feeling contact and immediately going down and that kind of stuff. I mean, these are things that can win big matches, when
So
it's a
there
tight
was,
game or whatever.
so yeah, there's that one in the second half. Um, it escapes me now. Anyway, all right, let's talk about. It's interesting. I always think it's interesting to see Company, managing in such a big game, given where he's come from. He's obviously done amazing things in the Bundesliga, but as he should, given the sort of resources he has available to him. Any particular thoughts on, just how reckless they play? Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I'll let you get that
Oh, no,
one.
it's fine. Sorry.
Yeah, I think anytime you've got a manager who's got an extreme style of play like that, there's a reason teams don't play like that, isn't there? Otherwise, it's been tried, and if that was a style of football that worked, then you'd see more teams doing it. So there's a reason it's a real outlier the way that they just play so high up the pitch and just play sort of all out attack, don't they? And I mean, it's fantastic to watch. And like I said, I'm rooting for it to work. But you just feel like, yes, it looks fantastic in the Bundesliga when you're just thumping teams left and right. And it's worked well at times in the Champions League. They murdered Atalanta, didn't they, home and away. The concern for me is when you look at the game at Arsenal back in November, they got pretty well beaten in that game. And I do think you get to a point where you come up against the best teams, and obviously they're going to be able to take a bit more advantage of how open you are at the back. And really they were fortunate that they're going into the second leg at 5-4. I mean, they were 5-2 down, and credit to them, they did manage to get it back, but they could have easily just been out of the tie, couldn't they, after this leg? So yeah, I don't know. I feel like, honestly, the odds for Bayern in the second leg, I wouldn't be backing them, I don't think. I feel like they're still going to be too open at the back, and I think a good side like PSG will probably exploit them, I think. And I fancy PSG to get to the final. But even if Bayern get through, I don't know, I don't rate Arsenal particularly highly, but I think maybe in a big game like that, just a rugged defensive style might win out over the all-out attack. What do you think?
So I think it's interesting because I said to you when I was watching when we were watching that game, and my immediate thought was this reminds me a little bit of NFL, where you have these high-powered offenses scoring points against some of the weaker teams for fun, blowing teams away, may have success against good teams as well, but when they come up against a serious defense, proper defense, it's amazing how often that defensive team comes out on top, because they were able to have some offense themselves anyway, but they nullify the attacking options so well. And one thing really stood out in that game on Tuesday night was just the quality of the attacking options. So the quality of the finishing. You look through the forward lines for both teams, it's just brilliant player after brilliant player after brilliant player. And I mean, that would be the only worry for Arsenal, is that they've got away recently on a few occasions with players not taking their chances against them. What you tend to see with these players is they will take their chances against you just that little bit more. But that was my overwhelming thought, is I can see Arsenal potentially doing a job on one of these two teams, because it'd be such a different type of game, and Arsenal's defence is so good relatively.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, I looked up that game in November between Arsenal and Bayern. So it was 3-1 to Arsenal. Bayern only managed 14 touches in the box in that game, which is unusual. And Arsenal had Marino who was still playing as the auxiliary centre forward for them at the time. So I guess what you would say is Arsenal were playing much better at that point. So Arsenal look like they've gone off the boil a little bit. It would be an interesting matchup, but yeah, I'm expecting PSG to go through of the two.
I guess one of the big talking points as well with regard to having seen that game was just the energy it was played at, and there was lots of chat about the Premier League, maybe the best league in the world, but it doesn't have the best teams in the world, and how fatigue plays a factor, and it does. Arsenal have got to go play Fulham this weekend. We've seen Paris Saint-Germain have numerous weekends off to prepare for these Champions League games. Bayern Munich have hardly had a testing, regular season, and it does make a real difference. And it's one of the problems I think the Premier League has, is it doesn't cater to Champions League football in the slightest. They literally don't care whether English teams are successful or not. It's just a byproduct. Whereas for the other teams, it almost feels more important for them to win the Champions League than a Bayern Munich to win the Bundesliga, for example.
Yeah, and I think just the fact that they are the best teams in their league by an absolute mile, aren't they? Bayern Munich and PSG. And even if you look at Spain, really, like Barcelona and Real Madrid are still way clear. Italy, I think Inter are by far the best team there. So a lot of these other leagues are just, they're sort of forming into a composition where you just have one or two elite teams and then the load of dross. Whereas the Premier League obviously just has that depth where, you're seeing there's a number of English teams could win the Champions League, and then behind them, a huge amount could potentially win one of the other European competitions. So, yeah, I think the Premier League is in a very dominant position at the moment, and the only way these other leagues can compete is just by putting all their resources into one or two super teams that can compete in the Champions League.
So, quick question then. Why can the Premier League not attract the star players in the way that your Bayern Munich, your Paris Saint-Germain's, your Barcelona's can? Particularly in those forward areas, even Real Madrid's. So yes, in England, we have, you have your Haalands of the world, but, you look at the Arsenal front three, dreadful, relatively, compared to what you're seeing from some of these other teams. I find it strange, given that the English teams clearly have the money, they're willing to pay the wages. I'm just intrigued as to why they can't seem to attract these players.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, one thing you'd say about that Bayern Munich front three, I mean, they did all come from the Premier League, right? You've got Elise, Kane, and Diaz. And also, if you look at Diaz, I mean, when he was at Liverpool, I mean, I think he was a very good player. I don't think anyone really saw him as being on that elite kind of level. So maybe just by virtue of going to Bayern Munich in this team that plays such an attacking style that really dominates their domestic league, so he's perhaps being made to look even better than he was looking at Liverpool. And who knows, maybe that's the same with Kane and Elise. Maybe, we don't know, right? They could get a transfer back to the Premier League and maybe they would look good, but maybe not quite on that elite level. I mean, I don't know. I think they'd look pretty good, to be honest with you. But
Diaz is interesting, because I was talking to James about him last night, actually, and he was just saying, how thrilled he was that Liverpool got 65, 70 million pounds for a 29-year-old at the time, who obviously played a part in winning the title, but he disappeared for large chunks of that title-winning season. He wasn't amazing for them. And, he just said it was crazy money in terms of what Bayern were willing to pay. I think you might have hit the nail on the head in that when you're up against weaker competition, and a lot of the time people just look at the numbers, so they'll say, Diaz has scored 20 goals, not taking into account that, it's against a lot of rubbish.
Yeah, and then he's full of confidence, and like you said before, I mean, they're not getting tested as well as the Premier League teams. So then when they come into these big Champions League games, they're full of energy and ready to give it 100% focus. Whereas a lot of these English teams, they're coming off a big match from the weekend, they're tired or whatever. So yeah, I think it's set up very nicely for a forward to go and play at somewhere like Bayern Munich. It's an appealing move, I think, for a forward to move from a decent Premier League team, go to Bayern and just absolutely murder that league and put up some good numbers.
So let's talk Arsenal game. Obviously, there were lots of contentious decisions in this Arsenal game as well. It obviously ended 1-1. Gyökeres scored a penalty, as did Alvarez. difficult to know where to start, really. I guess it was just a game. I think one thing before we talk about all the penalties situations, I do think Arsenal played quite well in that first half in terms of controlling the game, going to very tricky ground. You know, Atletico Madrid haven't lost their, in a competitive, I think, Champions League game for many, many years. You know, Arsenal, when they're quiet in the crowd, I thought they actually did a really good job. They weren't creating loads themselves, but I thought they did like a really professional job on them in that first half before Madrid turned up in the second half, sort of thing. Obviously, they had to because, they were trailing to that Gyökeres penalty at that point. Any thoughts on the penalty for Gyökeres? I guess that's a starting point.
Yeah, and I think firstly, you've got to characterise the Arsenal performance by remembering that getting Atletico in the semi-final is a fantastic draw. Like, this is not a good team, and they only got through because Barcelona had a man sent off in both legs, right? I mean, so it's an unbelievable draw. Still, it's not a super easy game or anything, of course, but compared to if they'd have got PSG or Bayern, it's an incredible draw. So yeah, they should be dominating the game and they should be getting through. The penalties, yeah, I mean the first one, I think, is just in that debatable category. I've watched it a few times and it's, I just think this is where I think we have to, as supporters, as watchers of football, we've got to acknowledge that there are so many of these decisions where you could ask 100 people and it might be 60-40 or 50-50 or whatever. It's just someone might think it's a penalty and then another person says, I don't think it's a penalty. The way I look at these things is from the defender's point of view. Okay, so we know that forwards are going to go down as soon as they're touched, right? Just like we were saying before. So I look at it from the defender's point of view. Are you giving the referee an opportunity to give a penalty? And really, I think the defender gets too close, and the way he puts his hands around as well doesn't look good. And I would say I can see why the ref's given it. And then you're in the lap of the gods, basically, aren't you? And certainly with VAR, as you always say, with one of those, whatever he gave on the field is going to stand. It wasn't going to get overturned, but if he hadn't given it, I don't think VAR was going to intervene and give it either. So to me, it's one of those, it's like a coin flip. You're going to get them sometimes. It was the most solid penalty, I think, from the two games, but I still probably wouldn't have given it. I don't know. What do you think?
I think we come back to that phrase, soft. And if you get one of those, it just feels like a bonus. And what I would say is Arsenal seem to have had quite a few of these sort of bonuses, this season. And I think that's one of the things that's underrated a little bit when you think about things like variance throughout a season. Is it's very easy to moan and complain, oh, we didn't get this decision, we didn't get that decision. But they actually, people have very short memories in terms of forgetting about, the very soft, that being a soft penalty, or the very soft one they had against Leverkusen when Madueke dived. It was just, it's very easy to forget, how important these little soft decisions are, in terms of your total season almost. But having, got the penalty, actually a really good penalty from Gyökeres. But the second half was interesting because Madrid actually got their pressing correct a little bit more in that second half and forced Arsenal into quite a lot more errors. And they were very dominant for that first half an hour of that second half. And yes, they've ended up getting another ridiculous penalty. But they were the better team by some margin, I thought. Yeah,
and you're right about the way Gyökeres struck that penalty, and I did notice as well the Dembele penalty for PSG. The ball striking now from these modern professionals, it's unbelievable the way they can strike it. The Dembele one, because he actually went the other way, of course, more of a side foot, the power that he got on it, just inside the post. But yeah, Gyökeres' one, I think it almost got Oblak in the face, didn't it? I think it would have taken his head off if it actually connected with the keeper's head. But yeah, the second penalty I don't think is even worth us talking about. It's just such a joke, honestly. These handballs. I mean, what are you going to say other than it's a complete joke? The third penalty incident, I guess, is the interesting one because I think you can see why the ref gave it. You can see why the ref overturned it. I think that's the one that Arteta's throwing his toys out of the pram about. And I think to me, it just demonstrates what a difficult job the refs have got. You know, everyone complains when they get things wrong, but these players are just so adept at playing for penalties. They know exactly what they're doing. He's trying to touch it past, get contact and go down, makes a very convincing job of it. And it's only really when you start watching the super slow-mos that you think, oh, I'm not actually sure how much contact there was. But yeah, that was a tough one. What do you think?
So I put a post out on Twitter yesterday, and it went a little bit crazy actually in terms of, you know, the number of comments about it. And essentially I was just saying that, you know, I think the right decision was reached, even though it may not have been the right process in terms of how we got there. And I think when you do look at, you always have to be very careful with the slow motion pictures, because I'm not going to say they're as misleading as the still pictures, but they can be a little bit misleading in that not taking everything into account. And I think what you saw from the slow-mo pictures was that the defender barely touched his foot. You know, he didn't pin his foot to the ground, he didn't smack it whilst it was in the air, and, you know, the contact was so minimal. And, you know, I then had loads of people yesterday saying, oh, but what happened after that? And I'm like, what do you mean what happened after that? The fact that at that point already, Eze's left leg has gone straight, you know, and he's then dragging it into the defender. You know, he's felt the slightest touch, and his automatic reaction is effectively to dive into, you know, the defender. And in many respects, if he hadn't done that, I suspect he would have got the penalty. You know, I suspect it wouldn't have been overturned. But when you saw his, you know, how dramatic he made it look, I think it makes you suddenly question, as a referee, you might be going, oh, that, you know, and you look at it a bit closer and you're happy to overturn it. I honestly think if he'd gone down naturally, he wouldn't have overturned that. And actually, the play acting from Eze, and let's call it what it is, you know, there's cheating, right? Has cost Arsenal a penalty in that situation.
Yeah, they're just trying to con the refs non-stop. It's incredibly difficult. And I agree with you. When you look at the super slow-mos, everything looks different. And I think people get a little bit obsessed about contact. They go, oh, look, there's contact. But, I mean, it's supposed to be whether or not it's a foul, right? Did the contact cause him to fall over? And I don't think anyone believes that for a second. So, yeah, I just sympathise with referees, and it just... Go ahead.
So what I was going to say, so one of the things I think that gets sort of lost in the contact argument is we have a situation here where it's the tiniest little contact on his boot, okay? Is it a foul? Is it a penalty? Is it not? And then we'll have these other situations in the box where you have two players, you know, barge into each other, and you have all the grappling, holding at set pieces, and all other manner of sort of contact, you know, far more physical than a little, you know, flick on the boot that isn't given. And, you know, you do have to ask yourself at some point, you know, is it a contact sport? You know, and I think people do get obsessed with the idea that every contact is a foul, and it's just not.
Yeah, definitely. And it's just a shame, I think, that you end up we end up spending so much time talking about these penalty incidents, right? And that just shows you how important they are to the game. You know, that you've got this game of football between supposedly two of the best teams in Europe, and yeah, that's what you end up talking about, is just all the separate penalty incidents from the game, none of which, well, I guess the first one was potentially a big chance, wasn't it? But the other two have resulted, one from just a random ball going into the box and hitting someone's hand, and then the other one is a player knocking the ball, you know, miles away from goal. Like, there wasn't a goal about to happen in that situation. But these are the situations where teams are trying to win penalties. It's not necessarily, oh, they were about to score and they got fouled. It's just any time you're in the box, basically, if you can win one, it's enormous for the team.
I also think there's no disincentive for a striker not to do it. As if you did bring in harsh punishments if you get caught to be cheating or diving, it would at least act as some sort of disincentive. But with the way football is at the moment, is given the reward is so high, these players don't care. They'll push it to the limits all the time in terms of what they think they can get away with. And as you said earlier, that on-field decision, if you get that on-field decision normally, then it's very rare it gets turned over. And actually, I think fair play to the referee for looking at, one thing I do wish actually a little bit was, and something James has talked about in previous shows, is I'd love the rather than VAR making that decision as to whether, he needs to go and have a look at the monitor type of thing. I would just love the ref to actually go, I want to go and have a quick look at it. So without necessarily VAR input, so he can go and watch it again on his own without having his mind sort of influenced, should we say, and then he can watch it back and make a decision as to what he saw in real time and what he thought he saw and what actually happened.
Yeah, and I wonder if they should be allowed to do these super slow-mos. I don't know. I sort of think, watch it back at real speed and see what you think. Because I do think things look different in slow motion. And again, I think slowing something down and seeing if there was a bit of contact, to me, it just sort of misses the point, because it shouldn't be about whether there was a tiny amount of contact or not, because it's not enough to knock someone over, So that's probably a change.
He went flying, John. There was massive contact.
Yeah, I hope is he okay? I don't know if he's out of the hospital yet.
I mean, the number of people who have commented on that Twitter thread saying, you can never have played football because you don't know what it's like, and then you actually see ex-professional footballers talk about it and say it's not a penalty, it's just, social media is amusing. One thing I do want to talk about quickly is Martin Keown. He has always been utterly insufferable, but I mean, unless it's just to garner, reactions from people, I just struggle to see what he brings. You won't necessarily have seen what Keown said, as you get a different feed to one we have, but he's an absolute clown. Honestly, I don't know even how else to describe it. Whenever I hear him on Talk Sport, his lack of impartiality when Arsenal are concerned has to be seen to be believed.
Yeah, well, I think pundits and co-commentators in general just drive me crazy. But certainly when they have the the ex-players from one of the teams involved in the game, I mean, it's an absolute nonsense. And it certainly happens quite often on the coverage I watch, because I think they appoint co-commentators based on who lives closest to each stadium. So you do quite often get ex-players from one of the teams, and the bias is pretty bad.
So let's talk last night. Well, just quickly finishing on the Arsenal. I mean, obviously Arsenal big favourites to go through now. I think all said and done, a good result for them. They should be able to get the job done at home. Although I'm not convinced they're still playing all that well. I mean, they keep grinding out results. The worry would be at some point, it would catch up with them. But there's not that many games left. So, if they can sort of hold on just for, another 2 or 3 weeks, churn out a couple more results, amazing opportunity to win multiple trophies.
Yeah, I think they've been quite fortunate with the way the fixtures have gone. I mean, obviously fortunate getting one of the easiest Champions League runs in recent memory. But also, if you look at the way the Premier League fixtures have gone, now I can hear people screaming that, well, yeah, you have to play every team twice, and that's true. But I do think that Arsenal were playing very well a little bit earlier in the season, and they got some of the tougher games out of the way at that time. They are clearly struggling a bit in the last couple of months. The form's gone off the boil. And they're coming towards the end of the season where you really wouldn't fancy them to be able to win a bunch of difficult games, but they've got a very simple run in, haven't they? Relatively, I think they got Fulham at home coming up this weekend. The most difficult one for them is going to be West Ham away because of the relegation fight that West Ham are in. But then after that, I think they've got Burnley and Palace the last two, so You couldn't ask for a much kinder set of matches to finish with.
particularly with Palace being involved in, they're likely to get to Conference League final as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that's fallen quite nicely for Arsenal, given that their form is dipping. I think it's quite nice that this is when they get their easier set of matches.
I just don't think there can be any excuses now for Arsenal. They've had so many little things go their way this season. Yes, they've had a couple of injuries here and there, but all said and done, not that many. And I just think when you think about all the cup draws and everything else that goes with it, is there can be they can't, how weak the other teams have been relatively. I just don't think there can be any excuses for them not to pick up silverware this season now. But let's talk Europa League last night. I don't even know where to begin with it. Obviously, Forest won 1-0. I mean, talk about well-taken penalties. Chris Wood, brilliant penalty. I do find football a frustrating game at times. As a game there's not much in, to be honest. And you look back, there's only maybe 3 incidents of note in the whole game. It wasn't particularly exciting. I mean, first one I would say was Emi Martinez's save. Was unbelievable. He is I've said all year long, he's been brilliant for Villa all year, and I don't think people quite appreciate at times just how good he is, and I think it's been a huge part of why Villa have overachieved for the last 3 or 4 years probably. And then you obviously have the Anderson tackle on Watkins, which wasn't even given as a foul at the time. Sort of given a cursory look by the VAR, if it was at all. I still not clear in my mind as to whether it was or not. I often talk with James about VAR isn't necessarily the issue. It's the application of VAR that is, I don't know. Everything I've seen from football in the last couple of years, I don't really understand how that's not a red card. Yes, he got some of the ball, but you can't go smashing into a player's standing leg with studs in a reckless manner like it was, and catch him, and and not expect to get a red card. If that was a Villa player who'd done that and he'd got a red card, I'd said, well, he deserved it. It just struck me as. And then obviously I had to listen to all the commentators saying, oh, I'm glad it wasn't given as a red card because it would have ruined the game and all this nonsense. It's just like completely missing the point. It was ultimately a reckless tackle, and Watkins is very lucky he wasn't seriously injured.
Yeah, I was surprised when he got up. I thought it might have been worse. I do think sometimes there's a bit of bad luck involved when you go into a tackle like that, and it just sort of happens that the studs come together with the standing leg. I'm not sure he went after the standing leg, right? I mean, Watkins was running at speed, so I don't know. I think that again, you start watching things in slow motion, things look worse. When the studs are involved, I also thought, oh, this could be a red card. I think in the Premier League they are obsessed with studs, aren't they? If the studs connect with someone's leg, then they normally get a red card out. I think if it had been a little bit higher, I think probably you would have been in trouble, but it was quite low down on the leg, so I don't think it was.
But I don't think it shouldn't really matter where it is on the like as long as it's not on the foot, right? Any time once you're above the ankle, that's leg breaking territory in terms of it doesn't matter whether it's 6 inches above the ankle or whether it's just below the knee. At the end of the day, it's a stationary leg that's there. And he's sort of crashed into it. And, one of the problems is you don't want to discourage tackling, okay? But when you fly into a tackle, that's when it becomes a bit trickier. And, he's done that. I think the point is, relative to all the other decisions that you get, that you see, if that had been a red card, no one would have said anything. No one would have said, oh, that's a bit harsh, right? And that's probably quite a good measure, I think, of whether something... It's a bit like the Eze penalty shout. Is if that hadn't been given on the pitch, it wouldn't have been over. It wasn't like VAR would have given it, wouldn't have overturned it, but no one would have remembered that incident particularly. I mean, Arsenal fans do have long memories, but But as a neutral, in the same way with the Ben White handball, if that hadn't been given as a handball, we wouldn't be talking about that incident now. And I always think that's quite a good measure as to an incident. If Anderson had been shown a red card, I just don't think anyone would have complained or been surprised.
I mean, yeah, I guess so. I think my general outlook is I give players the benefit of the doubt. And certainly, that's how I would referee games, and so you don't know. Is Anderson deliberately going in and trying to catch his ankle? I don't know. I just tend to think he's going in with a tackle and it's just kind of caught him by accident. But yeah, I mean there was also another comedy handball in this game, which again you just throw your hands up, right? Just well like Digne did, and you just have to say. Just sometimes you're going to get ridiculous penalties like that, but for me, I just wish they would just wave them off. I mean, who cares? Like he hasn't put his hands up like that because he's thinking, "Oh, I'm going to try and block this cross," right? No, nobody in a million years thinks that's what happened, right? I mean, it's just, if anything, I don't know, trying to get his hands out of the way, or you just do these natural moves, right, while you're playing football, and yeah, just at least you'd say it sets it up nicely for the second leg. That should be a good one, I think, with Villa at home, 1-0 down. That should be a decent match. I don't know, what's your level of confidence that they'll get through?
Not as high as it was. One of the problems with Villa at the moment is all the issues with Onana. We saw again yesterday when he's not there, and with Barkley not being an option to come in because he's not in the squad, it just look a little bit light. And obviously with Kamara being out injured, do look a little bit light in midfield. And long said, I think those central midfield roles are as important. Bar the goalkeeper, are so important in these games in terms of controlling matches. And Villa were noticeably poorer, I think, when Onana went off yesterday. So his fitness will make a difference. I am going to take one of the kids to the game next Thursday, so it should be good. Probably leave her in tears yet again. That's normally what happens with these things. But it also has potential to be a great night, so we will wait and see. But it's just annoying because Digne and the same applies to Matty Cash as well. They have these sort of brain farts in them, for want of a better phrase. They just do. They're so susceptible to just doing something so stupid. And yes, whilst it's a little bit unfortunate, you just can't do it. You can't make mistakes like that in these games. That was a game Villa shouldn't necessarily have lost. But now the margins of error, if Forest score a worldie or get a big decision or deflected shot, it becomes incredibly difficult for Villa. Just the margins of actually being able to go through now are just massively reduced. I'm not saying Villa have to be perfect, but they have to be pretty good.
Yeah, and I was actually looking up other all English ties in Europe, and I mean two-legged ties, not necessarily finals. And it's funny because I'd actually forgotten about Spurs Man City, which is quite a memorable one for me, but it slipped my mind. I think probably because of Spurs Ajax in the same year, which is one of the greatest sort of comebacks I've ever seen. But yeah, that Spurs Man City one was an incredible win. That was, I don't know if that was when City got over 100 points, but that was really sort of like peak Guardiola Man City. And I think Kane got injured in the first leg and then missed the second leg. And yeah, that second leg, Man City Spurs up in Manchester was an absolute classic. So maybe we'll see something like that from Villa Forest. That would be good. But I'm looking forward to it.
I like the fact you're reminiscing on the good old days, John. That's all they're going to be soon. It's just memories. It's going to be a long, long
That's all I got.
Long time before you see that Champions League again.
Yeah, but we might have a few thumping wins next season. So that's something to look forward to.
So yeah, I mean, just again, I said it after the Fulham game last weekend. There was just nothing really in that game between the two teams. One team gets a very soft penalty, and it was a penalty, but it's just an incredibly soft penalty, and that's the difference between the teams. Just a moment like that. And what always makes me laugh is the narrative that then comes on the back of it, where Forest played so well and all this sort of stuff. And you go, well, they didn't really play all that well, as the home team. It wasn't like, obviously Martinez has made that amazing save, but aside from that, I can't really remember him making a save of any note. It wasn't like they created all sorts of chances. But I guess that's football. I guess everything has to have a narrative applied to it. You obviously had Crystal Palace went to Krakow to beat Shakhtar Donetsk 3-1. They're now massive favourites to get into that final. I guess it always helps. You're away from home, you score in the first minute. I mean, it makes a big. And we talk about fine margins in sport, but scoring away from home in that first minute, really nice finish from Sarr. It just makes all the difference.
Yeah, and it's a weak competition, but then the Palace fans, they haven't been in Europe before, and I'm sure they had a fantastic trip out to Krakow, and they'll be enjoying it if they get to the final, and well, they look like they're going to get to the final. It'd be another great trip for them.
One thing that was interesting was that other game, so Rayo Vallecano against Strasbourg. So Rayo Vallecano ended up winning 1-0. Strasbourg were terrible. I would have thought they would have been the biggest threat to Crystal Palace, but they were awful in that game. They're lucky they only lost 1-0. So it'll be interesting. That second leg will be interesting to see if they turn up at home. Maybe it's since Rosinha's gone, his magic has left the building.
That's right, yeah, clearly. I did see the stats from that game. Yeah, Vallecano were easily on top. But sometimes that happens, and then the second leg goes completely the reverse. So I guess we'll see what happens in the second leg. But it was interesting. I was looking at the teams remaining. I think I touched on this last time I was on. The teams remaining in the Europa League and the Conference League. So there's this website called pitchrank.fyi. And what they actually have is they have rankings for all the teams in Europe, but it's from the betting markets. So they have mathematical system that compares all the teams based on how they're priced up in each match, and it's quite interesting. So if you look at the teams in the Europa League, you've got Villa 15, which they're obviously the best out of the 8 teams in those 2 competitions, and then Freiburg and Braga are ranked 61 and 68. Whereas if you look in the Conference League, Strasbourg 52 and Rayo Vallecano 59. Shakhtar aren't in it because it only covers the major European leagues. But I did think that was interesting that Freiburg and Braga are ranked as the 2 worst out of those teams. So that those Conference League teams are actually stronger. So it's going to be whoever gets through out of Villa and Forest. It's definitely going to be about as easy a final as you could possibly hope for. But what do you think about these competitions now? I was actually looking back at the old UEFA Cup, sort of reminding myself of how the format was, and it's a strong competition when you think that obviously the champions from each country went into the old European Cup, and then in England, for example, you had 4 teams would then qualify for the UEFA Cup. So if you imagine now, from last year, you would have had Liverpool going into the European Cup, and then you would have had Arsenal, Man City, Chelsea, and Newcastle all going into the UEFA Cup. And you'd have the same thing from the other strongest leagues, like, say, Germany. You'd have just Bayern Munich going to the European Cup, and then the next 4 into UEFA Cup. So the old UEFA Cup was an incredibly strong competition. And I feel like with these new format changes, it's just massively weakened the Europa League now, where I don't know, I feel like they've probably just put too many of the good teams into the Champions League at the expense of the other competitions. What do you think?
So I think one of the problems is just the lack of depth. We touched on it earlier about Bayern Munich, and I think one of the things that stood out in Europe this year, it isn't necessarily the strength of, say, the English teams, but just how poor the German teams, for example, have been beyond Bayern Munich. And I think, when you were talking about there in terms of UEFA Cup, so if you think that Bayern Munich would go into say the old European Cup, and the other teams would go into UEFA Cup. Those teams going into UEFA Cup wouldn't be adding huge amounts. I think what you're seeing is it's the English teams adding the depth to that competition. So if you had, in what you're talking about there in terms of you had the Spanish, obviously the second team in Spain would obviously be Real Madrid or Barcelona, so obviously would be very high quality. But once you get beyond there wouldn't be huge amounts of depth. I think one of the problems you have is the Champions League now is such a big format that, and when you do have these other leagues which aren't quite as strong, there's just not many good teams left after that, and so if you're not having teams filtering down from the Champions League into the old UEFA Cup or Europa League now, there just aren't that many good teams around, and what you're seeing is you are seeing the English teams dominate the Conference League, you're seeing them dominate the Europa League, because whether people like it or not, the 10th, 12th, 14th best team in the Premier League is able to stack up incredibly well against any other countries, even the top, once you get beyond about the third or fourth team, that Premier League team will be favourites against almost any other team in any of those leagues. It's just so strong in terms of, you saw Palace yesterday. Palace haven't played particularly well this year. They go away, they're going to win that competition easily. You touched on Villa or Forest, whoever wins that, they will win that. I'm almost certain they will win that competition. It's just the depth and strength of the Premier League is just crazy.
Yeah, and I was thinking, like, if you weren't English, how boring would those semi-finals lineups look in the Europa League? If you think of like Villa Forest, we find that interesting because it's two English teams. But if you were from another country, like Villa Forest would be one of the most boring, semi-finals you could imagine. And the other one, of course, Freiburg Braga, no one's interested in. So it does seem like as a competition, unless you support a team that's in it, or I'm just not sure that the Europa League or the Conference League are going to really draw much interest now from across Europe. And whether that's something UEFA will think about as time goes on, or whether they just don't care because they'll just put all their eggs into the basket of the Champions League, who knows? But I do think it's a shame that you're sort of, and I'm speaking as a fan of a team that won the Europa League last year, and it was great. But I feel like I'm glad we won it in that first year of the new format because it felt like a big win. And I said at the time, I think as time goes on, as English teams just murder this competition every year, it'll feel less special. Like in 5 or 6 years' time, when an English team wins the Europa League for the 6th year in a row, I don't think it's going to feel quite as magical for whoever wins it.
I don't quite know what they do to change it though, because in theory you'd only have 4 English teams in the Champions League, but because they've had the coefficient and because you get defending, it's looking like a good chance England will get 6. Oh no, not so much now actually, but they're going to have at least 5 teams in the Champions League. I don't know.
Well, they will have 6, won't they? Because if Forest win the Europa League,
yes.
they'll be in Champions League.
That is true. I was just thinking about Villa having to finish that 5th place, and then if they win, it goes down to 6th. I do one thing I do wish, by the way, is that we'd get back to these random draws. I'm so fed up of knowing who's going to play who all the way through. I mean, I have to stop that nonsense. But I'm also glad a little bit that teams don't filter down into that competition. It always seemed a bit of a nonsense where, a sort of unlucky loser finishing in 3rd place would suddenly get another crack of the whip. But honestly, having said that, I'm not sure there'd be many teams who would have finished 3rd that I'd been worried that Villa were playing against. Because again, the Premier League teams would fancy their chances against most of those 3rd place teams.
Yeah, I'm ambivalent about that. It did feel a little bit unfair that you finished 3rd and then you get another chance to win in the Europa League. But at the same time, I mean, it did improve the quality of the Europa League. And I think that I know what you mean, that you look individually at each team that would be dropping down and you'd say, well, I'd fancy Villa to beat them or whatever. But I think it does boost the overall quality if you just inject sort of 8 decent teams that would be among the strongest teams, I think, in the knockout stage. So Maybe that's something they will revisit, and they will think, but they can sort of have the best of both worlds, right? Because the Champions League, it doesn't affect the quality of that, right? That would be unchanged, and yet you're sort of giving the Europa League a boost.
I
So
mean,
maybe they'll reconsider that at some point.
maybe what they could do is, those teams who finish ninth to 24th, obviously they have that playoff match. Is maybe the losers of those matches could drop down into, Europa League or something like that. But I don't know. It's always tough when you're getting rewarded for being not very good. So one thing we did want to talk about is penalties. So we have talked about penalties, quite a lot already today. And something I've touched on before is one of the big problems we have with penalties is, these rules were invented, let's say, 100 or laws, let's call it by its correct name. The laws were, came about over 100 years ago now. And what we're finding with penalties is the reward of a penalty simply doesn't fit the crime that's happened. So when you work on the basis that a penalty is worth, I think it's 0.79 xg at the moment, and to create a chance worthy of 0.79 xg, it almost has to be a tap in from about 4 yards out with no one in goal. I mean, it's so difficult to create a chance worth 0.79 xg. And so what we have is a situation where you're basically rewarding teams with 0.79 of a goal, essentially, for innocuous things that simply don't merit that sort of reward. And so what you end up with is these teams creating scenarios like cheating, diving, to try and get the reward of a penalty.
Yeah, and I think that this is why you spend so much of your podcast and other people spend so much time discussing these refereeing decisions, right? Because we don't want to be talking about that. We want to be talking about the football. But the fact is, when you've got something that is going to suddenly give zero point 0.8 of a goal, it is the crucial part of a lot of games. And I think one of the problems for referees, or one of the main problems, I think, is it's very binary. They don't really have like a range of options available, right? If there's a potential foul in the box, they're either going to give 0.8 of a goal or nothing, right? I mean, they could potentially give a yellow card for diving, right? That's like the biggest negative that a player can get from it. So I think this is sort of a general problem in football, not just with penalties. If you think of like red cards, for example, again, it's like if there's a bad tackle, the Anderson one and Watkins, a good example, right? You think it should have been a red card. The referee, the only options he really has is he can send him off, which is absolutely enormous, and probably Forest would lose the game. Or he could give a yellow card, which is like, oh, a bit naughty, don't do that again. It's almost like no punishment, right? There's nothing in between. So I think that they could reconsider the punishments across the board in football, I think, and just say, well, hang on a minute. Shouldn't we have a few more kind of like in-between punishments where, like, if there's a foul in the box or a handball in the box especially, like, it doesn't have to be like a 0.8 xg. There could be something that's a little bit less harsh. One thing I've thought of is maybe you could have a second penalty spot, right? You could have the 12-yard spot like you've got now. Maybe you then have or edge of the box, let's say, right? On the line on the edge of the box. Same thing. The other players have to get out of the way and you get like a free shot. But instead of it being an 80% chance of scoring, I don't know what you would guess would be the percent of scoring from literally the edge of the box. It'd probably be 50%, maybe less, I think. So there could be sort of like a second penalty where it's like, okay, this was just sort of an accidental handball, so you only get the lower grade penalty. What do you think?
So I think the handball situation, I'd spend some time thinking about this. We've talked about this sort of stuff many times before. I have no problems with the handballs that we're seeing at the moment. Them just being a free kick. It can be a direct free kick. There can be an indirect free kick. You take your pick. Like, think through the penalty decisions we've seen recently. So Digne, right? If that's a free kick where the offence happened, who's going to be complaining about that, right? The Mendes one, a free kick. No one's going to be complaining. So I think the reality of handballs in terms of penalties, the reason the rule was brought in originally was to stop players on the goal line sort of diving to stop the ball using their hands. It wasn't designed for all these other incidental handballs that we're seeing. And as you say, there needs to be a little bit more. Yes, you do want a situation where you can punish a team if a player does, who was it? I think it was Nico Williams saved one on the line a few weeks ago for Forest where he tipped it over the bar, right? But that's a good example of where you do want a penalty for handball and appropriate punishment. But I'm not seeing anything with all these other handballs that merit something worth 0.8 xg. So let's take the Ben White one. Let's say Arsenal get a free kick just on the edge of the box. Who's going to think that was an unfair punishment for what happened? And I do think you almost need to start again with both penalties and the whole disciplinary system. Which we our WhatsApp chats are so often about this type of stuff. But it's some interesting stuff. But I just think that it's so draconian in terms of, let's take yellow cards. The range of punishments you can get a yellow card for are so wide. Sometimes it can be a little pull on a play. Might be taking his shirt off, or you can have a tackle like Anderson did last night. The range of offences for a yellow card, and what you also find is the referees have this preconceived idea that every little shirt pull, that's a yellow card. I don't know. It just feels quite a flawed system.
Yeah, and the worst one is the double jeopardy. So a few weeks ago, you had Spurs against Palace, and Spurs are 1-0 up in the first half, and Palace players clean through, and Van der Ven does a little tug back on him, penalty, red card, and it's you've lost the game at that point. You're 1-0 up, and then you've lost the game. And that just seems incredibly harsh. And I think the irony is they give the red card because they say, he's not going for the ball. So what you could do is you could just absolutely hack the player down and say, well, I was going for the ball, I just didn't get it. And then they'd say, okay, that's only a yellow card, and it just it just seems like a nonsense to me. I mean, the fact that you're getting 0.8 xg, like let's not pretend that when someone's clean through on goal that they're going to score it like 9 times out of 10. That getting a penalty is sufficient reward for almost any situation. Like if you're one-on-one with the keeper or whatever, you will take your 0.8 xg any day of the week over just being one-on-one with the keeper. All right, so you're already getting a good reward. You don't need to then send off a player as well. So yeah, there's definitely there's too many of refereeing decisions that decide matches, and that's why we have to talk about them so much, because that's what decides the outcomes.
I mean, I've always had a simple thought process on the double jeopardy stuff. You cannot or should not ever have a situation where the punishment is greater than a goal. So, obviously, with the sending off and the depending on when it happens in the game, along with the penalty, it's normally, particularly say that Palace game, which happened at the end of the first half, it's worth, I don't know exactly what it'd be worth in terms of XG, but you'd be up, be above 1.5, type of territory. And it just seems crazy to me that for something that's fairly innocuous, yes, he obviously pulled him back, but it wasn't violent. It wasn't like he went and headbutted him or karate kicked him there was nothing crazy with it. That you have something that's worth more than a goal. It just doesn't make any sense in terms of what was intended with the rules.
Yeah, and that's a good way of thinking about it. I mean, if you were betting in running on that game, Spurs are obviously 1-0 up. So if it goes 1-1, then it's pretty much an even game. I can't remember what the odds were in that one, but let's say it's pretty much an even game. But if it's still 1-0 Spurs, but down to 10 men, and the penalty, so you don't necessarily know whether the penalty is going to be scored, but you'd still have Palace huge favourites at that point, right? Because there's 80% chance of scoring the penalty, and then the whole rest of the game against 10 men. So yeah, you're right. I mean, it is literally worth more than a goal. This is the problem with red cards as well, is that the time in the game is a huge factor, right? So you could rugby tackle someone who's clean through in injury time, take the red card, and I mean, it's not going to make much difference to the outcome, right? The game's almost finished. Maybe the other team has a free kick 30 yards out that they're not going to score from. You'll take that all day long. Whereas penalty in 5 minutes into the game is an absolute, red card 5 minutes into the game is an absolute killer. So again, that's something where maybe if someone's clean through on goal outside the box, I would say just give a penalty if there's a foul outside the box, because then that just removes the whole time factor, because you're consistently giving 0.8 of a goal whenever it happens. So, yeah, I think I'd love to. Maybe we'll do a whole episode where we fix all the the laws of football, but there's a lot that needs to be reviewed.
Well, I just think we're able to look at things a little bit differently now. You know, you can actually quantify what a penalty is worth. You can quantify different situations. You can quantify what a red card is worth. You know, all the data's there from a betting perspective. You can sit down and work out what is an appropriate punishment. You know, when these rules were introduced, obviously none of this sort of applied. And the same happens with even yellow cards and all this sort of stuff. It just, I feel like you can make some logical decisions that would improve the sort of fairness of the game massively.
Yeah, and I agree with what you said before, right? I always go back to the spirit of the law. You think, okay, let's rewind to when this law was first brought in. Why did they have to bring it in? What were they trying to stop? You know, and clearly before they had the penalty area, before they had the penalty spot, you can imagine players were just absolutely brutally hacking down anyone that had a chance of scoring, right? So that's what it was brought in to stop. And what it's the beast that it's developed into, where players are just, you know, diving and silly handballs are getting given as penalties in a very low scoring sport. You know, it's out of control, I think. So yeah, needs to be reviewed.
So one thing which we did see is in terms of rules was for the World Cup. They brought in a few changes ahead of the World Cup. One of which is a red card for covering your mouth. Obviously that related to the incident. I think it was Vinicius, wasn't it, earlier in the year, where there was conjecture as to what was said. There's also a red card for leaving the field of play in protest. I'm not sure James will like that one, given he always tells me the player should just walk off and protest, but I don't think that one would work. And then the one I actually do like is the yellow card amnesty that they've brought in. So yellow cards get wiped clear after group stages and then after the quarterfinals. And it's one thing I never really understand, even in like the Champions League and stuff, is you want your bet, and it's the same with the Premier League. Given how many yellow cards that happen now, you know, this idea at the moment of players picking up 2-game suspensions after the 10th yellow card and things like that. The game has changed so much, and do you want the best players playing or not? You know, the idea that yes, you don't want players just consistently fouling. You know, you want to avoid that if you can. But ultimately, they're getting punished in the game by picking up a yellow card at the time. They're putting themselves in jeopardy of red cards, and you know, you see even with the red card situation with Romero, suddenly, you know, the second red card or whatever, 4-game ban. It just, I don't know. It just feels like you want these players to be actually playing.
Yeah, and again, I think it goes back to what was the spirit of the law when it was brought in. When they're bringing in red cards and suspensions, you know, for the first time, it was really you'd done something pretty violent that you know was brought the game into disrepute, kind of thing. The things that you get sent off for now. And certainly yellow cards. I mean, I just don't even know why that's a thing. Like, why should someone be suspended from a World Cup match because they got booked twice in 3 or 4 matches or whatever it is? You know, just I find it crazy, to be honest with you. The red card for covering your mouth thing just to me seems like one of those laws that kind of sounds like a good idea until it actually happens. Like, can you imagine if this actually happens? If during a match, you know, 2 players go together and someone does this and the ref gets out a red card, it's going to be absolute chaos, isn't it? Of sort of claiming, oh, he said this or whatever. I don't know. I think you're trying to directly solve one problem and then could create another one. So I guess we'll see if that actually happens. The other one, the red card for leaving the field is, I mean, it's probably fair enough. Leaving the field in protest, I should say, not just leaving the field for any reason. But it was a tough one. I mean, that Senegal-Morocco game, I could sort of sympathise with Senegal with some of the decisions. Like it did look extremely dodgy. But at the end of the day, it's a slippery slope, right? If you just start making it acceptable that any player or team can just walk off because they disagree with the decision, it becomes anarchy pretty quickly, doesn't it? So I think as much as we all get frustrated by referees and might have our suspicions on, reasons for decisions being given, I think you do still have to all abide by the decision and respect it, and then maybe protest afterwards through official channels or whatever. So yeah, I think that's probably a good idea to just nip that in the bud before other teams start doing it.
I just have visions of players, oh, John Terry, oh yeah, he's with his girlfriend, like his wife, or like all sorts of. I mean, people, a lot of them are friends, and they'll want to have little conversations where they don't want the. People lip read now and all these sorts of things. They don't necessarily want those conversations being in the public domain. There's nothing untoward about them or anything like that. I don't know. I just have visions of a player in the semi-final. He's playing against his mate or something, and they have a little chat, and then suddenly, red card changes the game. I mean, we've just talked about the punishments for red cards being so ridiculously high. And you have it because someone might accidentally be talking to a friend. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to happen just for any reason, though. So I think it's at the referee's discretion. So I think what they're basically doing is they're taking that exact scenario that happened with Vinicius and saying, well, now the referee would be able to send off the player. But yeah, how it'll actually go down in reality, I don't know. I did think it was funny, by the way, that I can't remember the name of the player that shouted the abuse at Vinicius, but I love the fact his defence was, no, it wasn't racist, it was homophobic. So he still got a 10-match ban or something for homophobic comments. But, I mean, that's a whole minefield as well, right? Because players will say all sorts of horrendous things to each other. Zidane famously with his headbutt, I think it was comments about his mother or something, wasn't it? Or his sister. And so you get into that murky area of like, yeah, you can insult their mother and you can say this or that, but it can't be homophobic, can't be racist, and yeah, I don't know. It's just an incredibly difficult area, I think, to try and arbitrate what players can say to each other.
So let's draw a line under that for now. So one of the big stories of the week, away from all the European action, was Scott Parker effectively being booted out of Burnley. Michael Jackson is going to take charge temporarily. What is interesting, he has done that job before. I was looking at it from a betting perspective, but I was looking ahead of their game against Leeds tonight. He did take charge for 8 games back in, I think it was 2022, after Sean Dyche was sacked. A similar situation towards the end of the season where they were already doomed pretty much, and what I was interested to look at actually was things like what sort of formations he liked to play. But as is often the case, John, he played 4-4-2 the first 5 games. They were actually they started off okay under him, and then the last 3 there was obviously 5 at the back. So I learnt nothing.
I think it's a headline writer's dream having Michael Jackson in charge of a football club.
So
puns galore.
So let's talk through that. Just let's have a quick look at the weekend's fixtures. Obviously, every weekend's fixtures now are just hugely important, to the destiny of whether it be the title or who gets relegated, and also those European spots as well. So, 4 games to go for most of the teams. Obviously, City have got an extra game at some point. But we have Leeds, Burnley tonight. Leeds, maybe need one more win to sort of guarantee safety. Not mathematically guarantee safety, but you think one more win would it would put them up to 43 points, which would put them 9 points clear of Tottenham. You know, you can't ask for a better fixture than playing the worst team in the league at home on a Friday night in front of your fans.
Yeah, not much to say about this one. Just you'd expect Leeds to win it, and that'll be them, I guess, officially safe. Yeah, Burnley just terrible.
So let's look at tomorrow's game. So we've got Brentford, West Ham, Newcastle, Brighton, and Wolves, Sunderland. Happy to ignore the Wolves Sunderland game. It's just very little sort of riding on that realistically. I think the Brentford West Ham game is obviously a very interesting game, given it's an interesting game for both teams. Obviously Brentford still have aspirations of finishing in the top 6. You know, that 6th place could be worth a fortune. It could literally change the direction the club's travelling in. If Brentford managed to make it into the Champions League, for example, the money they would get for that, you know, it could massively change where that club's headed. You know, so it is still a very big game for them. And then obviously for West Ham, you know, in that relegation battle with Spurs, I think I feel pretty comfortable saying it's a 2-horse race at the moment. It would take some pretty punchy results from Tottenham and West Ham to bring, you know, Forest aren't miles clear, but you still think they would have enough at the moment. But yeah, just a massive game for West Ham, and I'm sure you'll be rooting for Brentford.
Certainly will. Yeah, I mean, this is the type of game. I mean, if West Ham could go and win a game like this, I think, you know, that could be almost the final nail in the coffin for Spurs. But yeah, Brentford, I think the problem they've got is they've got quite a tricky run in, I think. From what I remember, I think they got 2 difficult away games left. Am I right in saying? And maybe they've still got to go to Man City and maybe, is it Anfield? I can't remember. But yeah, I think Brentford, really, they've blown their chance of the Champions League. They've only won 1 of the last 9, I think. So really, when it mattered, right when they had a great chance, they haven't had a good run of form. But they're still a strong side. You know, they'll be well fancied for this, I guess. Yeah, they're still in the sort of Europa conference hunt, but I feel like Champions League is going to be a tall order for them now.
I think it's always quite interesting when you watch, you know, we often talk about matchups and styles, and I actually think this is quite an interesting one because Brentford tend to be a little bit better, you know, a bit like, not quite to the same extent as Palace, but they're quite happy keeping things tight and then hitting teams on the break and in transitions. But I don't think West Ham will let them do that. So I think West Ham will actually sit back. And I think when you see Brentford play against those types of teams, they just struggle a little bit more. I think what you tend to see with teams like Brentford, and it's the same applies to Bournemouth and Brighton as well, is when teams come with a low block against them. And this shows you the different levels in the Premier League, is that, you know, the very best teams are able to break down those low blocks. But those middle of the table teams really struggle with it just because they haven't got the quality. You know, these teams are so well organised defensively that it's just very difficult to break them down because you're also leaving yourself vulnerable to counter-attacks as well. And it's something that West Ham have actually had quite a bit of success with recently, you know, with Somerville, with Bowen, is they look dangerous, you know, on the break. So I think it'd be quite an interesting matchup, just from a stylistic point of view.
Yeah, and again, I think just the pessimism of being involved in these relegation fights, which it's unfamiliar territory for me, but you do sort of feel like all the other teams are going to win, which, I mean, I guess they all did last week, right? But and it is an unusually strong year as well, so it's not like a normal season where everyone's terrible down at the bottom. You know, they're actually Forest, West Ham are actually playing more like mid-table sides probably. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think from a Spurs point of view, obviously just everything crossed. I just want Brentford to get it done, and of course they play before us. So yeah, not much Spurs can do. Could be going into that Villa game on Sunday like really needing a win just to stay in it.
Well, I think it's an interesting point because, you know, you could be 5 points behind going into that game, And it does change your mindset approach. You can't suddenly go into that Villa game if you're 5 points behind, going, oh, whereas normally you might have been, oh, we'll take a draw, we'll take a point, it's not the end of the world. It does change how you sort of approach that game because, even a West Ham draw, it puts a bit of pressure on you to make sure that you at least match what they've done.
Yeah, and I think just in terms of morale, I think it would just it's one thing going to Villa thinking, oh, if we win this, we go above West Ham. But I would imagine from the players' perspective, thinking, oh, we've got to win at Villa just to get within 2 points. That just seems like
Pressure.
It would be pretty crushing to the hopes of the players.
So the other game on Saturday afternoon was Newcastle-Brighton. Again, quite an interesting game, I think, because Newcastle are really struggling at the moment. They do have Bruno back, which obviously makes a big difference. But I think they're just struggling in terms of Howe's under massive pressure. They haven't got to the bottom of the issues up front. I don't know at this point as we record this whether Gordon will be back after his so-called injuries. And they've got a Brighton team who will really, really fancy their chances in this game. Newcastle will be expected to attack. They don't actually have huge amounts to play for, Newcastle. Brighton are obviously chasing that 6th place. They have it at the moment. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think Newcastle did look better though last week at Arsenal with Bruno back, and he is just such an enormous player for them. I don't know who else in the Premier League is worth more to their team than Bruno is. So I think that will give them a big boost. They still have the problems up front with having made those awful buys in the summer. But yeah, it might. I don't. Brighton are playing well, but it might be a little bit more of a tough place to go than it has been recently with Bruno back, I think.
I think it'd be an interesting game. I think I always think it's a shame when you get two games you'd quite like to watch end up clashing. And then Saturday evening, the 5:30 game, we've obviously got Arsenal-Fulham. I saw Fulham at close quarters last week. One thing they did to Villa was they played with a lot of energy. They pressed Villa. I don't know. They were quite aggressive with their pressing actually, which isn't what you normally associate with Fulham. I think they'll be really quite keen to put one on Arsenal here. And I always say it, obviously Arsenal are going for a title, but it's very hard to go to the well week in, week out, game in, game out, particularly when you've been away in Europe as well. I mean, this is the game for me out of the ones that Arsenal have left that has, I think it's very tricky. I think this could be a very tricky game for them. I think that first goal is going to be so important because if Fulham were to get that first goal, you'd see the crowd get all really nervous and, whereas if, the benefit they had against Newcastle last week is Eze sticks one in the top corner and everyone can sort of relax a little bit. You're not under pressure, so whether it be a piece of magic from someone or, a set piece goal, whatever it might be, it just feels like Arsenal, if they can get an early goal just to settle any nerves that might be there, they could run out comfortable winners. But I don't know, I was quietly impressed by Fulham the other day.
Yeah, I mean, it will be a tricky game coming in between the two semis like this. And this is where, when you look at peak Man City, just how good they were, because, of course, they're dealing with all these European fixtures and stuff and racking up points totals up near 100. It's incredible, really, that these elite teams are able to do it with this handicap of extra games, and then they're coming up against teams that have been game planning for them all week and they're well rested. And it'll be a tough game. They've been focusing on Madrid. They've been travelling to Spain. Fulham have been resting, training, preparing, and the league is deep. These are good sides, and so Arsenal, they haven't been in good form. You still expect them to win, of course. They're odds on, but I don't know. Could be a struggle for them again.
It feels like it has banana skin written all over it, but. And then on to Sunday, so it's quite a weird week this week in terms of where the games fall. So obviously we've got a Friday night game, we have two games on Monday because of the bank holiday. So we've got 3 games on Sunday, which are spread out, which is quite nice in some respects. So the first of those is Bournemouth Palace. I mean, Bournemouth are poor in these types of games just generally. I tend to find that it's just, when you get your Bournemouths, Brightons at home against these other mid-table teams, they just struggle. And for some of the reasons we've already touched on, I think they just struggle to break down some of these other teams. But Palace, being away in Krakow, they're just not bothered about the league now. And Bournemouth are. You wonder which Crystal Palace will turn up.
Yeah, and Bournemouth are really uh, their European chase is right in the balance now. I ran the numbers on this, and I pretty much got Bournemouth slight odds on to be in Europe in some form of Europe. So every game for them now is pretty big. So they'll be bang up for it, and um, yeah, and it's so big getting into Europe because we've talked about how easy it is, relatively easy, to win these European competitions. And so if you get into the Europa League, even a team like Bournemouth will fancy that they could win the Europa League, and that gets them a major trophy, and then into the Champions League, right? And even if you're in the Conference League, well, you'll be thinking of doing the whole ladder, won't you? You'll think, okay, win that, get into the Europa League, win that, get into the Champions League. Like it's not far fetched for a team to think that they could make a run like that. So yeah, they'll be pretty up for it. I think trying to get into Europe, and fair play to them. It's they're obviously doing something right behind the scenes at Bournemouth with their American ownership.
So we have Man United Liverpool. So obviously one of the bigger games in the Premier League, just generally. I did ask James about this match in particular last night. He was very positive about Liverpool's chances, as you can imagine. Obviously, Liverpool missing Salah, Alisson won't be fit either. I find this game a tricky one because I think they're two very average teams at the moment, and it doesn't feel like either team has huge redeeming features. But as a general rule, Man United are 2.4. It feels a little bit probably on the short side, but those injuries obviously aren't helping Liverpool.
Yeah, and we saw United playing basically on the break, didn't we? Against Brentford on Monday. They played like that against Man City earlier in the season. Carrick's first game, I think it was, wasn't it? And very effective. City had all the ball, all of the territorial dominance, and then United just shredded them on the break. And it's not hard to see this game going a similar way to that, where Liverpool maybe dominate possession, dominate territory, and then they've got a bit of a soft underbelly, haven't they, Liverpool? You could see maybe United just killing them on the break a couple of times. But yeah, who knows? Who knows how it'll go.
Would you want to back Manchester United at 2.4 in this game? I know I wouldn't. I just feel
No,
it just feels like there's better 2.4 shots out there, to be honest.
yeah, I'd agree with that. I think Liverpool, we still view them through a Liverpool lens, right? So yeah, they're poor compared to last year when they won the league, but they're still the third best team in the league. They're a better team than Man United for sure.
And then on to the big one, John. Aston Villa versus Tottenham. The only thing I'll sort of preface this one with is that I think the fixture list has fallen quite kindly for Tottenham on this particular fixture. There's other times of the year when this would have been a lot trickier than it is now, with Villa obviously having the semi-finals against Forest in between. I don't quite know what Emery will do in terms of team lineups, in terms of whether he will, Onana, for example, won't play on Sunday. I just wonder if he might make a few other changes, things like Maatsen starting. I wouldn't be surprised to see Mings start. Barkley will start, I'm almost certain. I wonder if Sancho may start, even an Abraham up front maybe, just to give Watkins a break. I mean, the only problem you have is that with that loss by Villa to Fulham is Villa aren't guaranteed top 5, and with the Europa League tie in balance now, had Villa won last night 2 or 3-0, they could have potentially taken things a little bit easier in this next week, so they may not have been as worried about that second leg. Um, I, ju- I, I just think it's a great time for Tottenham to play Villa in this situation.
Yeah, it certainly helps to be between the two semis like this. I think just the injuries once again are the thing that are sort of tempering any confidence that I have. I think there's been positive signs under De Zerbi. Obviously, got the finally got a win last week, but losing Solanke and Simons for the season, that just so light up front, and it was a forward line that wasn't exactly lighting the world on fire anyway. And then you take out two players like that, and it's unbelievable how it keeps happening. So we'll see. We'll see what he comes up with. I feel like goals are going to be a struggle, but at least it'll be a different game to the Wolves one. I think Wolves were just so unbelievably negative and defensive at home that even though, yeah, they're a poor side, but it's not easy to go out away from home and try and break down a team that's just bunkered deep. So at least with Villa, you know that it's going to be a little bit more of an open game, and so might get some joy with just having a little bit more space. And yeah, you just hope that just got to be bang up for it, right? Just a bit of old school kind of being fired up, because they know these every game now. To use the cliche, every game's like a cup final, and it is a bit like a cup final, to be honest with you, where you just sort of you have to just get it done somehow.
So whilst I think obviously it's a good time to play Villa, I don't think you're helped by it being a 7 o'clock game, because I think it'd been much easier for you if it'd been a 3 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon type fixture, because the one thing I think you'll even find from a Villa perspective as to how up they are for this game or otherwise is when it's an evening game at home on TV. I don't know. I think you tend to find the crowds a little bit more into it. I think
Is that a polite way of saying that they'll have been drinking for about 7 hours before the game?
bank well bank holiday weekend, absolutely. um, and actually Villa have quite so you used to always mock me relentlessly as to how bad Villa were against Tottenham, and they were for years. I mean, they had a dreadful record, but I think Villa have only lost twice in the last 9 games against Tottenham. So Villa actually are doing okay relative against Tottenham in recent times. I feel like we still owe you a few just to catch up.
Yeah, I think we won 8 in a row at Villa Park at one point. So yeah, you'll take a while before you match that. Yeah, I mean, obviously we've had so many times we've played recently where we just have a huge amount of players out, and once again that's the case this time. So yeah, it'd be nice. Maybe next year if we manage to stay up, we might actually be able to pit the two first teams against each other and see how that goes.
What I mean, this game always reminds me of the fact that my eldest daughter, her first trip to Villa Park, it's obviously travelling up from London, so long old day. Get there, she loves it all. Playing Tottenham, lose 4-0 at home. I mean, yeah, it wasn't her favourite experience, I don't think. But
But that was another one that had a red card, I think, didn't it? I think Spurs went 2-0
McGinn got
up,
sent
and
off.
then yeah, McGinn did I think he just got frustrated, and it was a bad tackle. But again, you talk about these big decisions by referees, and it's just like the end of the game at that point, isn't it? And it's a great example, right? You've literally taken your daughter to her first game, and
At Villa
yeah,
Park.
Spurs are 2-0 up, but you're not. It's not like you're out of the game at that point, right? Spurs are 2-0 up. You'd expect Villa will come back or whatever, and then they go down to 10 men, and it's just like a training exercise from that point on, isn't it? You might as well have left.
So, ironically, her first Villa game was against Fulham at Craven Cottage, when it was Steven Gerrard's last Villa game, where Douglas Luiz managed to get sent off as well. So, lost 3-0 that day. So,
You,
there's been good times and bad times, but
you've done well to keep her as a Villa fan after those two matches. I'm sure.
she
I'm
loved
sure she was asking if you could get her a James Maddison top or something, right? But you held firm.
who? I've forgotten who he is.
Yeah.
But I mean, massively important. All jokes aside, it's just question for you: would you take a draw now? If I said to you, you can have a draw.
No.
No, you need wins.
No,
I
I
guess.
mean wouldn't be a bad result in the just ordinarily, But yeah, just given the sort of game theory of the situation, it's it obviously will depend how West Ham get on, but no, I mean, it just a win is worth so much more than a draw that I think you wouldn't quite settle for a draw at this point.
I think your price is quite interesting, by the way, at 3.35, 3.4. Because based on everything I've seen, obviously Villa may make a few changes, and it feels like that's priced in. But based on everything I've seen from Tottenham, in the last 6, 9 months, with the injuries and the fact you are missing players, if Villa weren't coming on the back, if this wasn't a game sandwiched in between Europe, you look a very short price based on everything. Obviously you've had your first win in the calendar year, which gives an idea as to how much you have struggled. 3.35. You may be beneficiaries of wholesale Villa changes, but if Villa put out a decent team, it feels a little bit on the short side probably.
Yeah, no, I think we had this similar conversation last time, didn't we? Of how much do you price in the sort of need to win factor for these relegation teams, or the extra motivation? And of course, they won 3 out of 3 last week, didn't they? So certainly that theory held up last time. I do think again the injuries I thought maybe might move the price a little bit shorter for Villa. I think it nudged down a little bit after the injury news, but yeah, I mean it is a tough one. It's something I'd like to look into at some point. Maybe I'll do an article about it and look back over previous years when teams have been in relegation trouble and just see how much are they able to elevate their game. And it does make a difference, the motivation level of the opposition, right? And so it potentially helps that Villa have got their eyes on Europe and they're kind of safe for top 5. I guess also I can't remember who plays on the Saturday exactly, but it may depend how those results go, whether the extent to which they're safe. Like say if Brighton lose or something like that, that makes them even safer for top 5.
So let's talk. Monday we have a weird situation. 3 o'clock kickoff. Chelsea Forest. Again, I think it's quite a tricky game, just on the basis of you don't know which Forest are going to turn up. Obviously, Forest still needs some points for safety. So this isn't a game they can just sort of throw, for want of a better phrase. Obviously, Chelsea don't have Rafinha, so you're never quite sure what Chelsea are going to turn up. Obviously, Chelsea have to win this game if they have any aspirations of European football. Quite an interesting game without being pick of the weekend, I would say.
Yeah, and I guess it will be interesting. I mean, they beat Leeds in the semi, didn't they, in their first kind of non-Rosenior game? But I didn't really know what to make of that performance. It was Chelsea looked good early in the game, and then they went ahead, and then they didn't really do much after that. I mean, it was just sort of comfortable, right? They held Leeds at bay. Leeds didn't really create much, but I think Chelsea only had like 2 shots or something in the whole match after they went ahead. So yeah, it didn't really look particularly sparkling, and it's kind of an interesting dynamic, isn't it? Because they didn't respect Rosenior because I guess he doesn't have much of a CV in the game. But then, well, what do they think now about this temporary guy that's in charge? Like, are they, on tenterhooks in the dressing room as he's giving his pre-match speech? Are they listening to every word? I don't know. It just implies to me this bunch of players probably are not especially invested in him as a coach either. So. Yeah, I don't know. I'm not really expecting Chelsea to suddenly have a strong end to the season, to be honest with you. I can see it just kind of petering out going into the summer, and I think they do have some tricky fixtures as well. So yeah, I wouldn't be like smashing into them in any of the games coming up.
I definitely think that you could see their players get up for a game at Wembley just a bit more than they can, at Stamford Bridge. But these players have shown.
Yeah, well, you could imagine them winning the cup final, for example, right? You could easily imagine that Man City have got that fixture pile up where they've got league matches either side, and you could just picture it, can't you? Chelsea will, raise their game, win the cup final, and then maybe you only win one more league match or something like that. That's kind of how you could picture it going.
And then the final game, Everton, Man City, obviously massive for the title race. Tricky game for Man City. Everton, the home record this year hasn't been great, but it's shown significant signs of improving. Again, Monday night at Hill Dickinson, the crowd will be up for it. Everton's, still trying to get European football. I think it's a tricky game for Man City. I think
I don't know.
one of the benefits they have is that they haven't had Champions League football this week. It does make such a big difference. They are able to have a week off. I don't know if what the situation is with Rodri at the moment, things like that. But they've certainly had a week where they can recover and plan for these final few games. So you would expect them to come out firing in this game.
Yeah, and Man City, they're looking pretty good recently. So, yeah, all the cliches. Yeah, it's tricky on a Monday night. The crowd will be up for it. It's true, but I don't think Everton are that good, really. If you look at their numbers this year, I think they've punched above their weight a little bit. I think I'm expecting Man City to win this, and I wouldn't be surprised if it's a pretty comfortable win, to be honest with you.
Right, so I think that is all the weekend's football looked at. Any other thoughts before we go, John?
No, I don't think so. Gonna have to get myself off to work now, I think. So it's
Just
been
just
a
quickly,
fun chat.
where can people find you?
Yeah, if you're interested in checking me out on Substack, you can find my publication. It's called Unsupervised Football. So yeah, you go check that out. And I'm doing some stuff on the World Cup recently, and I always do Premier League reviews and just random articles with a kind of statistical angle normally. So yeah, check it out.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Thank you to everyone.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Luke. It was fun.